I don't take it lightly to speak on Sunday morning. I was in church ministry for 40 years, and the pulpit is a special thing. To me, the pulpit is a sacred thing, and for a pastor to trust somebody else in his pulpit, I think is a special trust, so I respect that. I appreciate that. I've been coming here for a few years, actually. In fact, one of the first trips I took was several years ago in front of your church. So we were talking about election integrity. Wisconsin has one of my favorite Capitol buildings in it. I think Missouri and Wisconsin are my two favorite. I've been in all the capitals. And you have this amazing dome with this amazing mosaic in it. There's like 100,000 pieces of glass in this. It's a stunning thing. And it talks about Lady Liberty. She's pointing towards heaven because that's the source of our liberty and our inspiration. And on the other hand, she's protecting the ballot box because that's how we protect our liberty. And that's what I'm here for. That's what I've been coming to Wisconsin for, teaching you guys how to take back your liberty. And I'm coming back again in January if you want to, if we're in the neighborhood. I don't know. It's going to be a different kind of trip because we're building a movement here to take back your elections from the WEC, which is a corrupt institution. So you want to take back your local elections. But I'm not here to merely talk about that. I'm here to talk about God and science. But I want to make the connection. I want to make the segue for you so that you can see why I think about this stuff. Because I'm not just a scientist, I'm also a Christian. I tell people I'm a real Christian. That means I know what I think and why I think it. But you know, Einstein said the strength of the Constitution lies entirely in the determination of each citizen to defend it. So each of us has to be defending the Constitution. But really, when you think about it, the Constitution was written during a time in America when we were having a great revival. It was the first Great Awakening, and George Whitefield was here preaching the gospel. It was a huge surge in virtue and goodness in our country. That's why John Adams says our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It was written during a time when we assumed that everybody would be religious and that everybody would be virtuous. And so that's kind of a fundamental idea. There's another fundamental idea that I'd like to kind of segue now into a little science. I think we as people today, we get educated and we learn about scientists. You know, we learn about Newton. I remember, first, second, third grade kids learn Newton's laws, right? I mean, do you remember Newton's laws? First law of motion, an object in motion stays in motion, right? The second law, usually they don't understand until they have a little algebra, because that's the sigma F equals ma, mass times acceleration. It's the equation. The third equation is for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? So you've got these laws. Everybody learns, but does anybody ever read what Newton actually wrote? No. Okay, you learn about Copernicus and the fact that he was a priest and studying the galaxy and the Copernican model of the galaxy, of the solar system, but did you ever read what Copernicus wrote? No. Did you ever read what Pascal wrote? Blaise Pascal. Well, here's something that Pascal wrote. He's one of the most famous chemists in the history of the world. He said, there's a God-shaped vacuum in the heart of every man, which cannot be filled by any created thing, but only by God, the Creator, made known through Jesus. Okay, does that sound to you like a casual Christian? That sounds like somebody who has a deep, profound faith. Well, I could, and I'm planning to today, intersperse actual quotes of what these scientists actually said. Now, you learn Pascal's law when you're in chemistry in college, but you never read what Pascal wrote. You don't read what motivated him. You don't read that actually what drove his science, what drove his interest was his worship. So there's like no conflict. People think there's a conflict between faith and science. That's just crazy. I'm a scientist, and I've been talking about science and faith ever since college when I first started reading what the scientists actually wrote. Last time I was here, I kind of teased you a little with this talk, and I think Pastor couldn't wait to get me back. But this is a fun one, and I teased you with this simple example. I like reading the Bible as a scientist. I like reading it as a father. I like reading it as a minister. I like reading it from different perspectives because the Bible is so rich in wisdom and so much information. And when you read Scripture, the Holy Spirit works in you and changes you, and it's a powerful thing. So I brought up the example of water into wine because when I was in college, it was my first year in college, I started reading the Bible as a scientist. And so I would look at each of the miracles and I would think, well, gee, what would have to happen for that miracle to happen? What would have to happen for that miracle? And so everybody always glosses over the water into wine miracle, but I didn't. That's an amazing miracle for a chemist because water is H2O, 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen, H2O. And then wine is, some trace minerals and some water, but 12 or 13% ethanol. Well, ethanol is C2H5OH. It's different. You got to get carbon atoms. So where do we get carbon atoms if all we have is H2O, oxygen atoms? Well, that's a nuclear reaction. Well, I can do that calculation, and I did, and it takes 4 Hiroshima bombs worth of energy to do that miracle. It's a serious miracle, and most people just gloss over that. Oh, big deal, water into wine, no big deal. Everybody focuses on, he raised Lazarus from the dead. Raising somebody from the dead is nothing. Just a little bit of electricity. And that's nothing. But water into wine, now that's a serious miracle, And so I like when you think of it from did Jesus say, I already told you, not turning water into pumpkin spice latte, When you think of it from a scientific perspective, it's fun. And I'll tease you with another idea, and I'll try to throw these in as I go. But when you read the Bible as a scientist, you ask certain questions, like the tree of life. So, we kind of take it for granted. But if you think about it, when God made us, He made us to live forever. He made these bodies to live forever. Okay, it was only because Adam and Eve sinned that they would die. So that means there must be a way for these bodies to rejuvenate, to renew. Think about that, okay? So the tree of life could have been, now I'm not saying I know, I'm just speculating because I'm a scientist. So the tree of life, remember when Adam and Eve sinned, they took the tree of life into heaven, and Adam and Eve were thrown out of the garden. And it says right in the Bible, the reason they did that is because otherwise they would have access to the tree of life, and they'd be able to live forever. So there must be something about that. There must be something you can eat that rejuvenates your body and allows you to live forever. Well, wouldn't you know it? Recently, scientists have discovered that the ends of your DNA, this is a DNA molecule, the ends of your DNA have something on there called telomeres. And every time a cell in your body divides, the telomeres get a little shorter. It's kind of like your bus pass. You do a punch on it every time and get a little shorter. And once the telomeres get to a certain size, then the cell won't reproduce anymore. It does apoptosis. It commits suicide. The cell says, I'm done, and it won't reproduce anymore. That's why, we lose our hair, guys, because after a certain number of divisions, our hair cells commit suicide. They say, well, you're not going to be there anymore. But scientists have discovered that they can feed mice a certain enzyme. And if they eat this enzyme, then every time a cell divides in the mice's body, only 1/2 of the telomeres will split. And the next time it'll be the other half. And the next time the other half. It alternates. And so a mouse that would normally live 2 years lives 4 years. In other words, what if you interfered with the telomeres completely? Or what if you were able to rebuild the telomeres? What if there's something you can eat that would... So in other words, this idea of the tree of life isn't just necessarily a fanciful, mythical entity. There's actually something you can eat that makes you live longer. Maybe forever. Maybe rejuvenate forever. So I like thinking of the Bible from as a scientist in a different way. And I mentioned this last time when I was in high school. I was struggling. I had a scholarship to Stanford for physics. I had a scholarship to UC Davis because I grew up on an Angus ranch. I thought I wanted to be a large animal vet. I had a scholarship to Music Academy of the West because I was studying opera and music. I'm also a musician. And then I was offered to go to West Point to help build bombs. And I remember sitting on my bed and out on the farm. I could still see myself, and this 45 years ago, sitting there on my bed looking at the letter from West Point and thinking, all right, when I'm 60 years old, now I'm 64. When I'm 60 years old, do I want to look back at my life and think, yeah, I made bombs? I didn't want to do that, and so I decided I would do something else. And so I was struggling, but I was struggling with lots of questions, because I would go to my pastor. I didn't have a smart pastor like Tim. I go ask questions, and they would give me stupid answers. And so I just thought, do I even want to be I was a believer. I believe in God. I'm a Christian, but these church things, man, they're just stupid people. I don't want to hang around with them. And so I was struggling with this, right? So I signed up for Bible college for a year. I decided I would go to Bible college for a year, and I would ask those professors, because they would know, certainly. And they're the ones who got me started on reading the Patriarch of Science. And boy, oh boy, I started with Copernicus, and I memorized this passage that he wrote. Copernicus said, "To know the mighty works of God, to comprehend his wisdom and majesty and power, to appreciate," and this is my favorite part, "in degree the wonderful working of his laws. Surely all this must be a pleasing and acceptable mode of worship to the Most High, to whom ignorance cannot be more grateful than knowledge." So, in other words, Copernicus saw his science as his way of worship, and all the patriarchs thought that way, and I'll show you some more as we go along of those. So I'm a real scientist. I made a famous scientific discovery in 1990. It made me world famous. Got nominated for a Nobel Prize in chemistry. I have 60 peer-reviewed publications. So I'm a real scientist, but I'm also a real Christian. And people struggle with that. How can you be both, Dr. Frank? And it's such an ignorant question. Because if you read history, if you read the scientists that modern science is built upon, we're all devout Christians. It's like I got a letter from a former student. He was getting a degree in electrical engineering from Ohio University, the Ohio University. There's a joke about that, I guess. But he wrote me an email, and he said, "Dr. Frank, I'm struggling." He says, "I'm graduating as a double E, and all my other 15 or so graduates are telling me that I have to sacrifice my intellectual integrity to be a Christian." And he says, "What do I answer?" And I say, "Why don't you tell them this? They just spent 4 years learning Faraday and Maxwell and Coulomb's laws, all these interesting equations, and learning to do calculus and differential equations." And I said, just tell them that all that 4 years that they just spent learning all that was all invented by Christians. Okay? All right. So if you had to sacrifice your intellectual integrity, then, okay, why did you waste your last 4 years, right? No, you just learned from people who had tremendous. So anyway, I started talking about that in the mid-'90s, and I got recognized nationally. How I understand my scientific by this award, Science is a Christian Vocation Award. So I started going the country talking about science as part of my vocation. And it was how I understand my scientific or educational work as a calling from God. How I brought my faith to bear on my work, and how my understanding the world from within my scientific or technological world has informed my Christian faith. So I got to publish articles and journals on talking about science and faith and the relationship between them. So that kind of got me in this mode, and people started inviting me around the country. So I've done this a few times now, and today I want to just give you a couple of ideas and expand your mind a little bit. But I'm known as a modeler. There's a joke. People say Dr. Frank has a graph for everything. I have a graph for that. It should be my motto. And I like studying things, but I always get to the bottom of things because I study them in a deeper way. And for 40 years, I was a music minister at different churches, church musician, youth leader, Southern Baptist music minister, Presbyterian, and my church was not doing very well, so I made a graph, okay? Because I have a graph for that. And I predicted where we're going to, when this church is going to fail. And I showed it to the church leaders, and I was on the board of the church, and I said, you guys, our church is doomed. We're going to fail. It's going to be dead by 2020, because I already know the half-life is 17 years, because I had modeled it, all right? And guess when the church closed? 2021. I was 1 year off. Not bad. I predicted it almost 20 years in advance. Now, why? In other words, I'm a math guy. I'm a modeler, and I like making predictions, but it's not just because, look at that, I can predict it. It's because it has meaning in your life. Okay, your church is going to fail unless you change, and here's the math that proves it. That's the way I think. Now, I mentioned that I'm here in the state because of we're building a movement here, and Trump is on board. So he even just posted this tweet recently. He says he's going to lead a movement for election integrity in the country. So that's why I'm here. So that's what's going on. But really, all that political stuff is really just, to me, a symptom of the real war. We are in a war between good and evil. And it's not, it seems like hyperbole to say it, but I don't think Paul was exaggerating. Reading from Ephesians chapter 6. Finally, my brothers, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. And after you've done everything, to stand. Stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And pray in the Spirit on all occasions, with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. I read on, but you get the point. This is really a war. And it's not a new war. It's an old war. It's a war that started before God made humans. There's where God hangs out, and then there's the heavenly realms, and then there's the earthly realms. The heavenly realms are where the angels and all that. Remember that Lucifer led a third of the angels against God. That was before God made man. So anyway, we're in a spiritual war. That's the point I wanted to make. And we're also in a political war. It's a fifth generation war. So I don't want to talk about I want to get us there, but you need to realize that this is connected. This is all connected, that we're in this war. It's Yuri Bezmenov, who was a defector from Russia. He said back in the 60s, he said the United States is in a state of war, undeclared total war against the basic principles and foundations of this system. And he talked about the series, because he was a KGB agent, he talked about the series of steps they were going to take in our country to take over our country without firing a shot. And it starts with demoralization. He also pointed out, and by the way, the reason why it's been so successful is because what does Satan do? Satan wants our human souls. He wants to corrupt nature. He wants to pervert God's purpose. So demoralization is right in sync with our collectivist enemies, our communist enemies. That's why it's been so successful in this country. They are amplifying one another. So we're not merely but we're asleep. That's our problem. We're asleep. We need to wake up. Awake. We need to rise up. That's what you said. We need to rise up. We need to wake up. So I'm delighted to be in a church, because I think that is sorry, I hit the wrong button. That is where this revival, this renewal of our country is going to happen, through the church, and I think the politics will follow. So I'm so delighted to be in a church that they understand that the ministers are actually leading this revolution. The ministers led the Black Robe Regiment. They are the ones who led our original revolution in 1776. And Yuri Bezmenov even confirmed that. He said the best defense against ideological subversion is to bring the society back to religion. And I just added this slide, of course, because of this recent situation. He says, we as Christians are called to go into the public arena and correct error with truth. If your pastor, which is not this one, but if you go to another church and your pastor isn't willing to engage truth in the public arena, go somewhere else. This is the time for that renewal. Since I was here last, I'm part of this Piece of Heaven.life. It's a ministry we put together out in California. We did this big weekend convention, Destroying the Whore of Babylon, this human trafficking. We raised $4 million in 2 days for Piece of Heaven. It's pretty exciting. Since we've raised another $2.5 million, we're buying this amazing facility, and we're going to be for ministering to children that have been trafficked. What we find is a lot of these children that have been trafficked are possessed with demons. We find that they've been engaged in spiritual warfare. So you can't just give them to like foster care homes. They need spiritual medicine. They need spiritual surgery. So that was a great day for us. We made our $4 million goal. So anyway, I just tell you about that. So it's not just a political war we're in. It's a spiritual war, and we need to get there. So I think let me make one more comment about that, I guess. I mentioned George Whitefield with the First Great Awakening in America. And de Tocqueville wrote about us as well. You know, you've heard Benjamin Franklin said, you know, he'd given us, during the first Constitutional Convention, he'd given us a republic if we could keep it. And the reason why he said that is because he realized and said and wrote eloquently, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become more corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. So the whole assumption of this country from the beginning was based upon this idea, the golden triangle of freedom. They talk about it in the Federalist Papers. Eric Metaxas taught me this. It's awesome. He says, if we want to have freedom in America, we have to have virtue. And then if we have virtue, in order to have virtue, we've got to have faith. And faith, this cycle is a self-supporting cycle. We cannot have freedom if we don't have virtue. We have to have virtue to leave each other alone. I mean, if I'm going around raping and pillaging, you're going to have to limit my freedom. But if I have virtue, you can leave me alone and I can be free and you can be free. And then you'll sometimes hear pastors say, well, we're just going to focus on the gospel. Well, then you're not following Jesus' example, because Jesus didn't just focus on the example. He cleaned the temple, and he took on the political establishment of the day, right? And if you're not willing to speak truth in the public, then you're not following John the Baptist's example, because he took on the morality of the leaders. It cost him his head, remember? So like I said, if your church isn't doing that, change churches. All right, so I think I've got that pretty much covered. I'm ready to jump in, I think, to science. When I was a youngster, I wrote a book called Credible Christianity. I never published it. It was about 20 chapters. And I asked questions. Each chapter was a question. And I like thinking about my faith from a question point of view. So let's just quote another scientist here. This is Louis Pasteur. He says, a bit of science distances one from God. Why would that be the case? Well, because you think you understand the universe and you don't need any spiritual intervention for it. So you think you can explain things without God. But much science nears one to him. The more science you learn, the deeper your understanding of God is and your appreciation for God. The more I study nature, the more I stand amazed at the work of the Creator. So, did you know that Louis Pasteur said that? Did you realize he was a Christian? It's an amazing thing. So, to me, studying nature is a profound thing. To me, my favorite philosopher today is Alvin Plantinga. He says there's a superficial conflict. Superficial, not a deep one. Superficial conflict, but deep concord between science and theistic religion. But superficial concord and deep conflict between science and naturalism. Most scientists today like to think of everything having a natural explanation, okay? And that seems easy at first until you actually look into it. So when you actually look deeply into it, you realize we have all kinds of conflicts in that area. But there's a great agreement, great concord as a scientist. And then as C.S. Lewis wrote, he said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. If I know God made the world, I'm expecting it to follow the rules he set up. So of course I'm going to go investigate. If I'm a Greek, I'm not going to invent science. You know why? If I'm a Greek, I think that the planets and the stars and all that are gods, and they have a will of their own, and they don't follow any laws or natural order. They just do whatever their whims suggest. That's, by the way, the word planet means wanderer. Okay, to them, the planets were gods, and they just thought, well, this god had that whim, and so there was no law and order to that, so why would you look for law and order? But scientists who believe in a created God would look for law and order because they would expect to find it. Now, there's an idea here. I mentioned it the other day in the car with Scott and Steph. He says, I'm not postulating a God of the gaps, a God merely to explain the things that science has not explained. I hear Christians make this mistake a lot. They'll say, wow, the clouds are thundering. That must be God, angry. And then later when we discover, no, the clouds are bumping into each other and that's a sound wave. Now we've explained away God, right? That anytime you come into a scientific thing that you don't understand, there's a gap in scientific understanding. Christians have a tendency to jump in that gap and say, well, that's where God steps in. It's called God of the gaps. That's a mistaken way of thinking, I think. I think it's more important that when we say we don't know, we don't know. And what happens is we lose credibility if we do that. But anyway, he says, Richard Swinburne, he's a colleague of John Lennox at Oxford. He says, I'm postulating a God to explain why science explains. Dawkins runs into this all the time. Professor Dawkins, who's a famous evolutionary guy. And Lennox argues against him, and he'll say, John Lennox, the famous guy at Oxford who holds the C.S. Lewis chair, he says, now let's say you're making an argument, so you're using your brain, right? Yeah. And your brain came about by random, natural, non-organized principles, right? Yeah. So you trust something that came along with no organization, no purpose, no teleology. You're trusting that? In other words, why does science work? Why do we think this way? It is a great question. I think God made us that way. He says, I do not deny that science explains, but I postulate God to explain why science explains. The universe was created with order and with nature. And one more for Kepler, and then I'm going to show you some cool stuff. Kepler says, we do not ask for what useful purpose the birds do sing, for their song is pleasure. For song is their pleasure, since they were created for singing. Similarly, we ought not to ask why the human mind troubles to fathom the secrets of the heavens. The diversity of phenomena of nature is so great, and the treasures hidden in the heavens so rich, precisely in order that the human mind shall never be lacking for fresh nourishment. This is Kepler. Kepler's laws are some of the most fundamental laws we use to describe the motions of the planets. Do these guys sound to you like casual Christians? I hear it all the time. Oh, yeah, Dr. Frank, everybody was a Christian in those days. No, these guys are profoundly Christian. They're profoundly deep understanding. It's powerful. I guess I should probably show you one more. Newton. Newton probably wrote the most important physics book in the history of the world. It's called the Principia Mathematical, the principles. And in his introduction, he says, he doesn't say it, this in his introduction, but in his introduction he says, I hope when you read this book that you'll have a deeper appreciation for God. But I like this phrase, I'll quote Newton. He says, atheism is so senseless. This is Newton. When I look at the solar system, I see the earth at the right distance from the sun to receive the proper amount of heat and light. And this didn't happen by chance. In the absence of any other proof, the thumb alone would convince me of God's existence. or he says here, this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only, that's a strong statement for a scientist to make, could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. This is not a God of the gaps. He's not saying, well, I don't have an explanation, so I'm going to stick God in it. He's saying the explanation that works is this one. You see the difference? This being governs all things, not as the soul of the world, but as the Lord over all. And on account of his dominion, he is wont to be called Lord God, I guess, Pantocrator, or universal ruler. Panta, meaning overall. I have to read the Greek. Anyway, get the idea. You see where I'm going? So, I don't want you to walk away from this thinking, Dr. Frank is an anomaly. I'm a real scientist, and guess what? As a real scientist, I have a deep appreciation for God and nature, which is a natural outcome of my science. And the more science I study, the deeper my appreciation for God is, and the more I love him. So now, Newton alluded to something there, or Kepler alluded to something about, it was Newton, the distance of the planets. So I'm just going to throw in another little piece of science, recent science for you. So we've got some new satellite telescopes up that we've never had before in the last 10 years. And by chance, we just happened to catch the collision of a neutron star, 2 neutron stars, very rare in the universe. We just happened to record the whole thing. And it disrupted the way scientists thought about how our universe came into being. And I'll talk about that in a second. Let me back away from this for 1 minute. I've skipped a step here. I'm not as organized as I like to be. Let me jump ahead to something. I want to come back to that because I think you need to have this concept in order to get the next concept. So when you look at the moon, isn't the moon lovely? When you look at the moon, you're not looking at the moon the way it is. You're looking at the way the moon was about a second ago. Because the light that is reflected off the moon from the sun takes about a second to get to you. So you're seeing the way the moon was about a second ago. When you look at the sun, you're looking at the way the sun was about 8.5 minutes ago. So if you think about it, if you're on one of those days where you can see the moon and the sun at the same time, you're actually looking at 2 different moments in history. You're looking at a second ago and 8.5 minutes ago at the same time. If you put Mars next to it, it's hard to see all 3 at once, but you get my point. If you had Mars next to it, you'd be looking at, that's 22 minutes ago. The further out you look in the universe, the deeper into time you're looking. So the cool thing about the universe, especially astronomy, is when you look further away, you're actually looking deeper into history. It's like a record of history. I'm not saying this is the case, but let's say that the sun vanished right now. It's gone. Well, we wouldn't know for 8.5 minutes. We'd still see sunlight for 8.5 minutes, and then suddenly it would stop. So the sun, some of these stars and galaxies we look at today might not even be there anymore. Because the light is still en route to us as it's getting here. And Hubble really improved our ability to look at things that are far away. But anyway, let me go back to where I was now. I needed to cover that concept to really hit this idea with you. It was the neutron stars. Here we go. Boom, there it is. So it was very rare. But something that's so cool about it is the Hubble model of the universe goes something like this. I'm not saying this is what I believe, but this is the standard Hubble model. It's that there's a big bang, and there are certain parameters that control how much energy and mass there was at that moment. Boom. And then as it began to cool down about 300,000 years later, then matter began to condense from just heat and energy to simple baryons, simple electrons, protons, things like that. And so at that moment, then the universe could light could travel in between particles. Until that point, it was just kind of a big, massive ball of energy and heat and light. And that's when we measure the microwave background from there. And so then the universe continues to expand, and then as it continues to expand, stars begin to condense, galaxies begin to condense, and there's this about 14 billion years is what the Hubble model is. Well, as stars condense, they gather mass, and then pretty soon they get so much mass and so hot that they explode. But what the Hubble model says is that when all that mass comes together, you actually have fusion. So you start with hydrogen atoms, protons, and they condense. Now you make helium, and you make lithium, and you make sodium. You make these heavier and heavier elements. So the stars are where the elements are made. So then you make heavier elements, and then boom, it goes supernova, and then those heavier elements can collect into another sun, and boom, they can make even heavier elements. So there's the mathematical model that scientists have been using for many years is this cycling of stars, and that's where we're supposedly getting our periodic table. The thing is the math doesn't work. And so they've been struggling for decades to try to figure out, even no matter what model we put together, we can't seem to make the heavier elements. Until about 5 years ago, they measured this neutron-star collision and noticed that the heavier elements resulted from the neutron-star collision. So now they've had to completely change how they think about the universe. But here's what's fun to think as a Christian for a minute. This is an extremely rare event. There are only a few places in the universe where two neutron stars have collided. Guess what? In order to have life, you have to have a periodic table. We just happen to be in the neighborhood where a neutron star collision took place. And so that's one of the points that Newton was alluding to. He was saying, gee, everything is just right for us to be here. The conditions for life are highly, finely tuned. Otherwise, we wouldn't even be here. So, for me as a scientist, when I was in high school, the question was, people were still thinking about the universe as a Big Bang, Big Crunch. Big Bang, Big Crunch. Big Bang, Big Crunch. The universe was forever. And that was the paradigm of science at that day. Now, as a Christian, I would read the Bible. It doesn't say that. The Bible doesn't say that. The Bible says at some moment in time, God went, let there be light. Boom, there was light, okay? So to me, it seemed like it was in conflict. But as of 1996, the scientists have concluded, astronomers around the world, that no, there was a Big Bang, and that was the beginning of space and time. That's when space and time were made. So guess what? There is a beginning, and it's not enough. There isn't enough mass in the universe for it to come and have a big crunch. So guess what? The science has now come along finally to the point where there was a beginning, and it's where it's a one-off. Our universe is a one-off. It's fun. So the reason I bring that example up is because when there seems to be a contradiction between science and faith, don't try to explain it away. Just say, okay, there appears to be a contradiction here, and let's kind of just wait and see what happens. Because the Bible didn't change in my lifetime, but the science did. So which one am I going to trust, right? So I think that's kind of how I look at things. But to me, it's not the end of the world. Am I going to go to hell if I don't believe that the universe is 6,000 years old? No, I don't think so. I do, but we can have that argument, right? We can debate it, and it's fun, and afterwards we can have a beer together, or maybe some wine that Jesus made. All right. Let's see now. Let's jump on. So that, for example, that would be like, how old is the Earth? That's a question people always ask me because they think, oh, well, you're a scientist. Do you think the Earth is 13.8 billion years old? And I'm like, and it's funny. What do you mean, Big Bang Theory? Someday I'll ask God, and he'll tell me what's really going on. So I always answer this question with another question. So let's say that you go, I'm a physicist, and I invent a time machine, and I go back to the 8th day after creation. And Adam walks up to me, no clothes. He walks up to me, how old is Adam? And people usually say, oh, he's 16 years old, 18 years old, something like that. And I say, no, he's 2 days old. He's 2 days old. Okay? And there's fruit on that tree over there. How old is that tree? You know, the ripe fruit on that tree that Adam can eat. And it's a 30-year-old tree, something like, no, it's 4 days old, okay? So in other words, God created the universe with age. He had to, right? He didn't create Adam as an embryo. He created him as a full-grown adult. So if I'm a scientist and I've taken my time machine back to the 8th day and I want to know, I wonder when God made all this. And I take my tree coring tool and I go over to one of those fruit trees and if you've ever seen a tree coring tool, it's like a tube you push into the tree and you can take it out and you can count the rings and figure out how old the tree is. And let's say it says 30 rings. Well, is that tree 30 years old? No, it's 4 days old. So that means God must have created that tree with age. And he must have created Adam with age, right? He's 16, 18 years old. He must have created that star with age because we're sitting in the garden and I'm looking at starlight. He must have created the light in place. So even if you're a young earth creationist, you have to admit that God created the world with age, the universe with age. So it's sort of a moot question. God could have created all of us a second ago, including our memories. So it's not a question that we can answer with science. Some questions we can answer with science, some we can't. This is one we can't, because you can come up with a natural explanation, but is that really what happened? Well, I don't know, because God created Adam 18 years old or whatever, right? He could have created the universe 13.8 billion years old. I don't know. So I'll ask him someday, and he'll set me straight. We can have some lemonade and talk about it. But does it freak me out? No. Is it a catastrophe for my faith? No. It's fun to just think about and have a discussion with God about, and maybe we'll figure out some interesting things in science. All right. Now, my most favorite topic in my personal spiritual life is the incarnation of Christ. To me, this is the most amazing thing ever. That an infinite being outside of time and space, who created time and space, the scientific cosmology model that is predominant today is that space and time came into existence at the moment of the Big Bang. When God said, let there be light, space and time were created at that point. There is no time where God is. So the reason why God knows what the future is because he's there. He knows what the past is because he's there. He's not in a timeline like we're in a timeline. And scientists have already easily proven that there's no such thing as time anyway, which is interesting. Isn't that interesting? So I've done a whole series of talks on Philippians 2. It's one of my favorite. Let me just bring that up. Philippians 2. Because the nature of Christ to me, right? I'm thinking as a scientist, well, how could an infinite, timeless being come into our time zone? How could that happen? Well, Philippians 2 describes it. Paul says, therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete, Paul says, by being like-minded. He's talking to the church in Philippi. Having the same love, being in one spirit of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. In your relationships with another, have the same mindset as Jesus Christ. Paul is telling you, have the same mindset as Jesus Christ, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Where the Bible actually says, the Greek word is to be clung to held on to kept as a strategic advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. So we've got an infinite, timeless being who decides he's going to be made into human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. So this is a profound thing that happened. Because you have an infinite, timeless being that limited himself to living in time. You know, I joke about it, but when Jesus was born, he crapped in his diaper just like I did, right? And he had to skin his knee just like I had to. He had to go through all the same temptations, and he had to confine himself to time. And he was divine, he's God's son, but he was limited while he was on earth. And then, therefore also, God highly exalted him. This is after he was resurrected, and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth. Heaven, earth, under the earth. You see, he's looking at these perspectives, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. So this emptying of himself is a Greek word. Form is morphe, but the Greek word is emptied, ekenosin. It's like if we were all to stand up and walk out of the building, we would ekenosin this building. The verb is emptying. So for Jesus to empty himself, he had to take some of those divine attributes that he had, and he had to put them on hold while he was on earth. And remember, even when the disciples said, when is this going to happen? When's that going to happen? Jesus says, only the Father in heaven knows. So he also limited his divine knowledge. And I love that, reading the temptation of Christ when he was, after 40 days in the desert. That deals with this whole idea too. But the idea that, and yeah, let me just talk about that for a second. So there were 3 temptations that Jesus had, right? The first one, Satan comes up to him and says, hey, you're hungry, 40 days. Make these stones into bread. If you think about it, there's nothing wrong with him doing that. He fed 4,000, and another time he fed 5,000 people, you know, two fish and 5 loaves or whatever, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But if you read the passage carefully, Satan was saying, you turn these stones to bread. Use your power. Reassimilate your divine attributes and use your divine attributes. If you look at the miracles when Jesus fed the 4,000 and the 5,000, he didn't say, y'all watch now. Boom. He said, Lord, please bless this food. God did the miracle through him. Jesus was the example of a perfect human. He couldn't be more than human, or as you read earlier, through one man sin came into the world, through one man we're redeemed. Jesus was quantitatively one and qualitatively human, a perfect human. He was the perfect sacrifice for us. If he was more than just human when he was sacrificed, it would be an inappropriate sacrifice. So he had to limit himself for this 33 years on earth to what we are. And if you think about that, that's actually inspiring. Because, you know, okay, sure, Jesus never sinned, he's God. No, he was limited to the same things we are. And the miracles he did were done through him. When he gave the authority to he said, all authority has been given to me, and then he gave authority to the disciples, and they went out and did miracles too. And when they came back after he sent out the 70, they were like, dude, we did all kinds of amazing things. And Jesus says, you're going to do even greater things than me after I'm gone. It's not about Jesus' power. He limited himself to being a human when he was on earth. It was about God working through him, and that's what he was showing us. So that I love that. But the temptation of Jesus Christ, I think, illustrates that so beautifully. And then the second temptation, remember, was Satan says, go in the temple and throw yourselves down, and the angels will catch you. Well, that's sort of forcing God's hand, isn't it? Can you force God's hand? No, so he shouldn't either, right? So he didn't. And then the last one, Satan says, okay, I know why you're here. You're here to redeem the world. I'll tell you what, I'll make it easy for you. I'll make it easy for you. Just bow down and worship me, and I'll give it all to you right now. I'll give it all back. You don't have to die a miserable death on the cross and suffer. And Jesus said, no, I'm here to sacrifice and die to pay the sacrifice. So you can see it, the temptation helps you understand the nature of Christ. But anyway, so thinking about those things, you can tell as a scientist, I understand that time is not real. I understand that, that there's design and law in the universe. So I like trying to think about these spiritual ideas from that perspective. Now, last time I was here, by the way, Pastor, you guys did the same worship songs. And something tells me that there's a theme in there. He's probably thinking, gee, Dr. Frank's going to be talking about nature, so we want to have some nature worship songs. I bet you that's what was going on there, because I know the way your mind works. I love that. All right, so Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. So this is what Stephanie's been looking forward to. I know she's going to like this. I told you about the Hubble model. The Hubble model, whereas we had the Big Bang 14 million years ago, or maybe 6,000 years ago, and God just created the history of it, whatever. And then what happened is that there's just all this heat and light, and then galaxies begin to form, and here we are today. Galaxies. Now there's a new satellite out there, the Jack Webb telescope, and when they put it up, suddenly we had trouble, because Jack Webb can see further out, and we already have galaxies already here. So get ready for all of the cosmology to go through another major change. They call that a paradigm shift. Do you notice that I'm not saying, see, that proves the Bible's true? I'm saying, let's go for the ride. Let's watch the science develop, and it's probably going to converge to the truth eventually. It may not, but science usually converges towards the truth. And isn't it lovely that it's converging towards what we believe as Christians? Looks like that's not a surprise. So up in 1989, we put a satellite up. It's called the Kobe satellite, and we measured the microwave background of the universe. This is the whole universe viewed by this satellite, and they noticed that it wasn't smooth. It was amorphous. But they noticed that there was an interesting symmetry to it right up the middle, but they weren't sure what to make of that. So we put up the Planck telescope in 2009, and then the amorphous that we saw in this other image was confirmed by this. It's the same, but they noticed that it's really symmetric, and there's this axis on the middle, and this was when Bush was president, and he had talked about the axis of evil. So astronomers joked and called that the axis of evil. Guess where we are in Earth? Right in the center, right on the axis. Okay, how about that? Okay, and that answers a big question that scientists have struggled with for years, because it appears like we're in the center of the universe. If we're in the center of the universe, then we're right where the Big Bang was, and we're the oldest part in the universe, which answers the Fermi paradox, it's called. The Fermi paradox is, if the universe is teeming with aliens, where is everybody? Well, and Enrico Fermi was the physicist who was the theorist for the Manhattan Project. He's a brilliant theorist, brilliant physicist, not a Christian. But everybody was saying, well, if we all came here by natural phenomena, then there's going to be other civilizations around the universe. Well, not if we're the oldest one, not if we're the first one. And so it's an interesting answer to that paradox, that question. So I like that one. All right, so I want to show you some actual data. One of the problems we have in our society, here we go, is that we watch so much science fiction that we watch Star Trek, and we watch what's the other one, Stargate, and all these Star Wars, and so we get used to seeing all these images. You have to realize that's all made up. So I want to show you what it really looks like. Okay? Now, what Hubble did, maybe we could dim these lights a little bit. Can you dim this? Yes. So what Hubble did, we were asking, where's the oldest, coldest place in the universe? So Hubble aimed at the darkest place we know in the night sky. I just came back from Maine, and you could see the the Milky Way, just like solid, just massive stars. And most of the stars that you think are stars that you're looking at in the sky are actually not stars. Most of those are galaxies or combinations of galaxies. They're so far away, a star isn't bright enough, you wouldn't be able to see it. But there's so much. So Hubble trained itself on the darkest place. Yeah, see, this is nice. The darkest place in the universe. And then it zoomed in it. And it took 3 weeks for it to do this. So I just thought you'd like to see what that really looks like. So this is actual, real data. Before I do this, let me back up. Sorry, oops, I clicked the wrong button. Do you see this right up here? That's Orion's belt. You recognize the 3 stars there? And actually they're a galaxy, but that's Orion's belt. So that kind of orients you a little bit. So now Hubble is going to zoom in on the darkest place. Now what you're going to notice is that you get to a certain point, and then everything goes dark. How come? I'm going to pause right there. How come everything goes dark? The answer is because now we're out of our galaxy, and there's nothing. We're here, and we're looking out, and once we're outside of our galaxy, space is almost completely empty. There's like nothing, practically nothing out there. But anyway, so let me go on, continue the video here. Here we go, back to this again. So starting that again. I thought I hit the button. Yes, good. All right. So the stars in our own Milky Way galaxy, and now we're going outside. You also realize we're looking further into the past, aren't we? The further out we look, the more into the past we're looking. So it's really quite empty for a while. And every once in a while, there'll be a star that comes by that's in our own galaxy. But it's just zooming in, zooming in, zooming in. Now something's starting to happen. Now we're starting to see stars? No. We're starting to see galaxies. And if we start at that faraway distance and we pan, this is a star in our own galaxy, so it's kind of difficult, and we pan zoom, you're actually looking at what's really out there. Look at all these galaxies. And this cool, different galaxy. Can you imagine these billions and billions and billions and billions of stars out there? To me, it's awe-inspiring. Now that we have the new Jack Webb telescope, they're going to do this again. It takes special conditions, so you can't just do it any day. That's a star in our own galaxy. Look at the whole galaxies. Some of these are on edge, so it's hard to see them. But this one is perpendicular to us, so we can see it. This panning ends at Andromeda, the closest galaxy to us. It's almost there. So this is not Hollywood. This is real. There's Andromeda. Is this stunning? And that galaxy is rapidly traveling towards us. It's going to collide with our Milky Way several million years from now. Billion years, I guess. So we know that we are doomed. Exactly. There's an existential limit. So if you think, you put the lights back up. So if you think about this, the fact that we know that galaxy's headed, barreling towards us, proves that we're a temporary thing. Humanity is a temporary thing. But if you look at the back of the moon, I wonder if I've got a picture of that one handy. Maybe I don't have a picture of that one handy. If you've not seen the back of the moon, it's awesome. The back of the moon is just pockmarked with crater holes because there's no atmosphere and no to smooth it all out. So it's like a record of all the collisions. Our side have some big craters, but it's not nearly as pockmarked as the backside because the moon kind of defends the Earth from being bombarded. But what that tells you is that in the past, it's been a tumultuous place. Our planet has been bombarded quite a bit with asteroids and comets and whatnot. And we need the moon to kind of defend us from a lot of that. So we live right now in a period of time that's calm. It's geologically calm. If you look at the United States, There's the caldera, the Yellowstone caldera. It's like covers 3 or 4 states. It was a huge super volcano in the middle of the North American continent. If that thing went off today, that's an existential event. There'd be no life left on our continent. Okay, so we live in this really interesting period of time. So whenever I read in the Bible, and when the fullness of time had come, I always think to myself, okay, so God built this universe designed for his beings to live in for this period of time, and he needed it to be relatively stable so that we could actually have an opportunity to learn and go to church and have children and families and worship God and discover God and study God. So there needed to be a relatively stable period of time for us to live in for this to happen. There's another aspect to this that I think I like doing thought experiments. So let's say you're God. Let's pretend we're all God. Put your thinking caps on for a minute. And you want to have beings that love you, serve you, can interact. Let me try it another way before I come back to that. So I have a beautiful wife. We've been married 43 years, and we don't agree on everything. And that makes it fun. We agree on most things. We have 3 beautiful kids and whatnot. It makes it interesting. Do I really want to have a wife who always agrees with me? No. Do I really want to have a wife that, yes, honey, and here's your dinner, honey, and I cleaned the house today, honey, and, do I really want that kind of a partner? No. I want to have some, yeah, he says, yeah, in your dreams, buddy. But I want to have somebody who is a true independent agent, is truly has free will, that chooses to love me, that chooses to put up with my frailties and my stupidness sometimes. And I think that relationship, I want it to be a genuine relationship. So with God, when he creates us, does he want us to be robots? Does he want us to? No. So he's going to have to create a universe. He's going to have to create a universe where there's free will. But how can you create a universe where there's free will if everything you do is predictable? And this is the whole Calvinism Arminian argument. If you're a Calvinist, did you really have a choice? And if you're Arminius, well, everybody has a choice. You're AG here, right? Mostly. So, Assembly of God, most AG churches tend to lean Arminius, that people have a choice. If you're Calvinist, it's like you didn't have a choice. You can't resist the Holy Spirit calling you. But we could go in, that's a whole nother discussion. But the fun thing is to think about, okay, if God, I'm talking about science today, if God's going to create, or if I'm God and I'm going to create a universe, I'm going to have to create the universe with some kind of wiggle room. Because if I create it without wiggle room, then my beings were totally predictable. It's like, okay, ho-hum, why would I want to create that? So it turns out there's this really interesting thing that we've learned in science. It's called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And people are confused by it. And basically what the Heisenberg uncertainty principle says is that you can never know at the same time where something is and how fast it's moving simultaneously. The product of the uncertainty in position and the uncertainty in speed, if you multiply those two things together, the uncertainty is always greater than a certain number. It's called Planck's constant. In the universe, you cannot know that better to a certain amount of a degree. And a lot of times people think, oh, that's just because we need to be able to measure it better than that. We just need to have finer techniques. No, it's a fundamental limit of the universe. My fundamental discovery that I made exposes that as well. It's not, oh, we could just do a better job measuring it. No, it's a fundamental property of the universe. It's a fundamental property of the universe that you can't simultaneously know precisely the position and the velocity of anything. Now, how does that play out in our lives? How does that play out in our choice? Well, we have brains. We have neurons and chemistry going on in here. And think about it. Every one of the atoms in our brains has a certain amount of uncertainty associated with it. Every one of the electrons traveling around those atoms in our chemistry in our body, there's a certain amount of uncertainty associated with it. God created it that way. That's the wiggle room. So there's room for, even as a physicist, even though I'm a modeler and I like to be able to predict everything, there's a limit. There's a fundamental limit built into the universe for how well I can predict something. And I think that's where our choice comes in. That was not an accident. So you can see I'm just kind of rambling on a little bit now, but I could talk about these topics for hours. How long did I talk? Not long enough. Unless you have a question, maybe I should just kind of wrap it up. Unless you want me to keep going. When did I start? I can take questions. That's a good idea. I'll take questions. But I like what Einstein said. He said, science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. Fundamentally, their science is different than religion in a fundamental way. Science is where you explore and try to understand things, but science doesn't tell you why. It tells you how. Science tells us why. So you might say, well, gravity works like this. It falls. Why? And if you talk to physicists, they'll say there are 10 fundamental properties in the universe that are just, they are. There's no why. That's the way it is. One of the properties is the speed of light. One of the properties is the gravitational constant, G. I put that up there a minute ago, big G, Newton's gravitational constant. It's interesting because that raises the whole fine-tuning argument. The fine-tuning argument is that just take the gravitational constant. If I drop something, it falls at a certain rate, depending on the mass of the two objects. Why is it that way? Because God made it that way. But a scientist can't say that. A scientist can say that it does do that, how it does that, not why it does that. Okay, see the difference? So anyway, the gravitational constant. Now, it's a big number, 6.67 times 10 to the minus 34th. Anyway, it describes how mass attracts one another. If you spread that number over the whole universe that we have right now and divide it up into 1-inch increments, if the number G, it's the letter G for it, was 1 inch shorter or 1 inch longer, our universe wouldn't exist right now. It's so finely tuned because what happened if this gravity was slightly stronger during the Big Bang, it would have collapsed right back on itself. If it was slightly weaker, boom, it would never have condensed into stars. It's just right. It's tuned just right. So you'll hear a lot of scientists, physicists who are trying to prove creationism. They'll try to say, it's a fun argument. It's called the fine-tuning argument. There are about 10 parameters that are finely tuned. So finely tuned that can't be an accident. And so then what will happen is people who say, well, they're atheists, they'll say, well, just there are infinite number of universes. This is just happens to be the one that has the right parameters. So they have to postulate infinite number of universes. But if you think about that, that's not a scientific claim because you can't measure it. So that's a faith statement, isn't it, that a scientist makes. Now, maybe I'll finish with this. This is fun. So, what is the nature of the universe? How could a universe exist if it came from nothing? That's a problem for scientists. So you have to have a cause, right? You have to have a first cause, as Aristotle talked about. You have to have a first cause. So the leading atheist in the world, Lawrence Krauss, a leading physicist, I should say, has written this book, How Could a Universe Come From Nothing? And he has a whole mathematical model that he describes how it come from nothing. Because to him, nothing is an equilibrium between matter and antimatter. So it exactly cancels out. So there is nothing. But all the time, there's a little statistical variation. So things can temporarily come into existence and out of existence. There's like this equilibrium. So there's truly nothing, but something. And so then, but that doesn't really solve his problem because then people could say, well, where did that come from? Where did that equilibrium come from? It's an infinite regression. You can't ever answer it. So in the end, that's why I put up that quote, you really can't answer some of these questions with science. Some of these questions you end up just having to say, that's the way it is. And we just have to accept that. And maybe that's the way God designed it. And to me, that actually makes it more fun because I like it that there's uncertainty. And that's a technical term, uncertainty. It's Heisenberg uncertainty principle. I like it because that's how God could have injected free will into a deterministic universe. So, I mean, that's kind of a fun way to think. So how about if I just stop there then? And unless somebody has a question you want me to, you have a burning question about, how does science and faith relate to one another, Dr. Frank? Yes, yeah. So, the God particle. So, there's a fundamental problem in physics, and chemistry too, but let's say physics. So, if you look at a hydrogen atom is just a proton. Well, but what's holding that proton together? What actually keeps it together is a hypothetical thing called a gluon. And scientists can't tell you what stuff is, they just can tell you how it behaves. And so I can't tell you what gravity is, I can just tell you how it behaves. Students say, but I always ask students, what's gravity? Oh, it's a force, Dr. Frank. Well, what is it? Are there little green men that are invisible that are pushing it down? What is it? What is it that does that, right? You don't know. We can describe how, but we don't know what it is. The God particle is an attempt to try to explain how everything is holding together. Because it can't. What is it that's holding it together? Well, what does the Bible say? Colossians, all things hold together. So that's why, that's kind of, how about that I try to keep it simple.
We always hear that they're doing something nefarious, like they're trying to completely, like, there's different people, or different people,
Yeah.
That say that that's very nefarious, and they're trying to become immortal without God. And so, I mean, is that really what's going on, or is there
There's a war. And there's scientists or naturalists are always trying to find a way to explain away God. But you never can really succeed at that. I'm so glad you said that. There's I love C.S. Lewis, but I tell you, he was my go-to guy all through high school. I think I read everything C.S. Lewis ever wrote. Everybody knows he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, and those are great stories. But he also wrote a science trilogy. It's called the Space Trilogy. And nobody ever reads that. But it's like Narnia for adults. And it's awesome. And there are three books. It's a trilogy. The first book, I don't want to give it away in case you want to read it. The first book, the protagonist goes to Mars. And Mars is in the state where the Garden of Eden has just happened. And the inhabitants of Mars are now just been kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So they're naive, they're not technological, they've just sinned, and they're kind of working through that. The next planet he goes to is Venus, and on that planet, it's called Paralandra, the name of the book. That's the name of the planet too. It goes to Paralandra. That's still in the Garden of Eden state. And the protagonist, I don't want to use his names because I don't want to give stuff away. He meets with Eve, and he spends time with Eve and witnesses her being tempted by Satan. But she survives it. But to give you an idea of what Paralandra is like, the protagonist, his name is Ransom. He lands on Venus, and he gets out of his spaceship, which I don't want to give away. He gets out of his spaceship, and he looks up at a tree, and there's a piece of fruit, and you realize, man, I'm hungry and thirsty. He reaches up for the fruit, and it turns out to be a bubble, and it goes pop, and it kind of showers him with moisture and nutrition, And he goes, wow, and he describes this amazing experience that he has. And then his first instinct is, that was great. I want more. I'm going to do it again. But as he reaches for another piece of fruit, he goes, wait a minute. That was perfectly satisfying. So you can tell what C.S. Lewis is doing is he's exploring what would a perfect world be like. And that's just one example. It's just so amazing. And he goes through the temptation, and he actually explores the temptation of Eve in the same way Jesus would have been tempted. It's a great, great book. Paralandra, I love it. But you reminded me of the third book, which is called That Hideous Strength, when Ransom goes back to Earth, and by the way, C.S. Lewis wrote this in 1942, I think. And when Ransom comes back to Earth, Earth is like today. Not like it was 80 years ago. It's prophetic. And it's humans trying to live forever, creating machines to sustain themselves forever with artificial intelligence, etc. And C.S. Lewis wrote this 80 years ago. It's brilliant. It's shocking, and I reread it again last year because I only had read it when I was in high school many years ago. So it's amazing how well he predicted that. So that would be a fun one, and I don't think it's too far off. And that sort of answers your question. Yeah, anyway, somebody else had a hand. Hi, brother. Yeah. And that's part of the fun of it.
My question for you, I'm kind of a big fan of Francis Collins.
Yeah, he led the signature. Yeah, correct. Right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And I'm wondering, what differences or similarities
Yeah.
you have with Francis Collins' cosmology?
Yeah. What a great question. There's actually some really good stuff in there. So let me start at the beginning where you talked about Dawkins. So Dawkins is the leading Darwinistic evolutionary theorist in the world. He's known as the father of that. And, you'll hear him in debates all the time, in debating that. The thing that Dawkins is limited to is he can't tell you how life happened. He can just tell you what happened after life starts, because you have to have living reproduction in order to have biological evolution. So he'll freely admit he doesn't understand how the other stuff would happen. Now, even that, though, I think he makes several logical errors since that. But it's fun. And in the 1980s and 90s, he and Stephen Jay Gould were holding an across the pond, they would call it, across the ocean, debate on evolution. And I was reading in Scientific American every month. Stephen Jay Gould would write an argument, and then Dawkins would write, and they would go back and forth month to month. And it was really fun to listen to them debate. So here you have two strongly atheist biologists disagreeing on evolution. And so if you think that everything's all figured out and they all know everything, no, that's not science at all. There's a true debate. And so I appreciate the next part of your question, which you were saying, well, Francis Collins doesn't agree with Dawkins here and here. There are nuances and differences. Now, Francis Collins does believe in that God used evolution to make us. He does think that. I don't necessarily think that. I think it's an interesting idea. I think it's more important that we as Christians don't glom on. I mean, Einstein said a scientist who believes his own theory ceases to be a scientist. I think a mistake you make is if you glom onto one point of view and then hold on to it, you're closing your mind, and that isn't what science is about. Science is about constantly questioning what you think you understand and then growing and learning. And I think that's the right attitude. So it's like if I say, well, the earth is 6,000 years old, I think that's a mistake. I could be. It could be 13.8. God can decide that, and he can tell me how he wanted to do it. So did God use evolution to make me? I think there's huge problems with the current evolutionary theories. In fact, Darwinism, neo-Darwinism it's called, is dead. It's been dead for like 40 years, but it's still taught in the textbooks. And so there's a book by a guy named Michael Behe. Michael Behe, he was the one who testified in the Dover trials. Not Dover. Yeah, it was. In the early 2000s. He's a biochemist. He wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. It's one of the best books written on the subject, I think. It's 1996 it was published. And he basically shows that the current neo-Darwinistic models that Dawkins so espouses are incapable of accomplishing what he's claiming. So really, Dawkins will say evolution is what gave him the ability to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. He thinks he has a natural explanation for how we got here. But you notice that he's doing the same thing I just said a minute ago. He's choosing a faith path. He's choosing a worldview. And that's why he's done that. I prefer to just keep my mind open and say, okay, what's the new science we're learning now? And God can explain it to me later if I don't get it right now. It's not a critical thing to my salvation. I'd rather be open-minded. Now, Francis Collins, he led the Human Genome Project, and which was a collaboration of universities all around the world, and they were using a sequencing model where you would take a DNA and bust it up into pieces and then send that around to people around the world, and everybody was sequencing their little part, and they were putting it all back together, and it was going really slow. And then a guy named Craig Venter in the Venter Institute, he came up with what's called the shotgun method, where he takes DNA and just blasts it into a billion little bits, sequence them all, and then reassemble the puzzle. And you can do it all at once. And that's turned out to be the way everybody does sequencing these days. But the reason I segued to him is because he's probably the leading geneticist in the world today. In fact, he's the one who took 4 bottles of chemicals, is how he describes it, A, G, C, and T, the 4 components of DNA, and built a custom DNA molecule and replaced the DNA in a living cell. So he basically reprogrammed a living cell. He did that in 2007 and again in 2009. So it's very interesting. The reason I brought him up is I'm kind of nuancing what your question is. He doesn't think that could have happened naturally, that evolution could happen naturally. He's what they call a panspermia guy. He thinks that life came to Earth from outside of our planet. Because it's too complicated what has to happen, and there's no natural phenomenon which allows amino acids to assemble. Amino acids that to assemble DNA have to have an infrastructure. So you have to have the information already there in order to assemble a protein. Well, where did the information come from? Well, you have to have proteins already assembled to create the information, but you have a chicken and the egg problem. And so there isn't enough time to make that random. So why did I bring that up? Because you mentioned not Lennox, you mentioned Dawkins and who's the genome project again? Francis Collins. Francis Collins is a Christian. Dawkins is not. Venter is not a Christian. And neither was Stephen Jay Gould, who I knew well, by the way. I used to take students to meet Stephen Jay Gould. He's a pretty cool guy. I think he had a close encounter with God before he died. It was a very interesting thing. But anyway, 4 different views, all leading scientists, all highly respected, differ on their cosmology dramatically. So I think that should tell you something. Why do I need to choose one camp? Why not learn each camp and then kind of explore the nuances in each one? Have I addressed your question? I didn't talk about E equals MC squared yet. Yeah. Yeah. 1864. 59, sorry. Oh, I'm talking about, that's the, that was his second book, the Descent of Man, yes.
So, basically talks about the beauty of looking at life coming about through this way.
Yes.
I guess from my perspective, looking at things, you can say, God created the world in 6 24-hour days. They're greater things. But if God is really, really great, he could take and say, well, create this big bang 14 billion years ago. And then we have the beginnings of life 3 billion years ago.
He could have set the whole thing up. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
But God, instead of looking at it as a series of changes, it's like using an integral or a derivative. The small little changes are microscopic and happening in
Yes.
such a subtle and elegant and beautiful way that only God could have done it. So,
They call that theistic evolution.
I would disagree on many different things, but I'm looking for something that we can agree on.
Yeah.
And that other people, science and people, they could agree on. So something that might bring us together rather than
Right. What you just described as theistic evolution, where God used, basically put it all in motion. And then sometimes they have another version where it's progressive evolution, where God every once in a while had to stick his finger in the pot and guide it a little bit. And they're different views. And I don't have any objection to any of them, actually. I think it's fun to talk about them. And which ones are more likely to be correct than others, I think is fun to debate. Could. And I have no problem with that. Yeah. Or he could have been more deistic and stepped back and just set the top in motion and everything, which would be amazing. I had a Sunday school teacher who was a professor at a Southern Baptist seminary, and he said that all the miracles that happened in the Old Testament were preordained to happen. This parting of the Red Sea wasn't God intervening. That was a natural phenomenon that had been just happened to correspond to that moment in time at just the right moment. And I thought, that's pretty preposterous. And he looked at me and he says, well, I guess my God is bigger than your God. And I thought that was a pretty good argument. I mean, it's possible that God could have put everything in motion ahead of time. He's that big of a God. Or he could have put his thumb on the scale every once in a while or intervened every once in a while. I'm good with all those things. I don't have any objection. I think it's like we don't need to argue about how many angels can fit on the head of a pin. I don't see any value to that. I don't see any reason why we need to disagree. I think it's more fun to explore. What do we know? What do we don't know? What do we know? What do we know is real from the scripture? What do we question? There's lots of stuff in the Bible. What was Jesus' hair color? Do you know? I don't. He's probably dark because he's Mediterranean, right? He's probably pretty dark hair. The pictures we see of Jesus painted by Rembrandt and whatnot, I don't think that's how he looked. You think he wasn't much to look at, Bible says, right? And he probably had darker skin because he was northern Palestine, right? He's probably doesn't look like what people... Now, are we going to argue about it? We're going to argue about it. I don't think that's productive. I don't see any value in that. I think it's more fun to think about, well, what would it be like? One other thing I'll mention as a scientist, because I'm trying to keep this science and faith. I didn't talk about E equals MC squared. We can come back to that. Calvin called it the doctrine of a combination, the theologian Calvin, John Calvin. He says, you have to realize that any truth or any knowledge that God would reveal to us would have to be dumbed down. It would have to be accommodated to us. And so I'll use the example of Mary in the Annunciation. When the angel comes to Mary, the Virgin Mary, and says, behold, you're going to become pregnant, you're going to give birth to the Son of God. So in her mind, was she thinking, okay, so is God going to provide the Y chromosome? And is he going to use my egg and my X chromosome? And he's going to bring that together. But wait a minute, what about some of my DNA that's corrupted? How is he going to clean that up? And is that what she's thinking? No, that's not what she's thinking. That's the way we think today, and so if truth was revealed to us today, it would be in a different kind of way of thinking. Instead, how would Mary think? Well, in those days, they thought that the man planted the seed in the woman, that she was just the fertile ground. It was a self-contained seed already. So he would plant the seed, and then the seed would, and so the womb was just the fertile soil for the lady. And so that was no big deal to her. Okay, God's going to put the seed in there, it's going to grow, but if you follow what I mean. So you have to think about it how they would hear it. So when you talk about the Old Testament's 6 days, 6 literal days, they even had a different worldview. They thought there was earth, heaven, earth, and under the earth. They had their own paradigm. They didn't even know the New World was here, right? So you have to hear it with their ears. And so when you listen to Scripture and read Scripture, you need to listen like you were one of them to really understand the doctrine of accommodation. E equals MC squared. So your question, if I remember, you said, which came first, the mass or the energy?
That's what I asked Dawkins.
Well, they're the same thing.
But something had to start. Something had to be there. A priori.
That's the infinite regression problem. The moment of the Big Bang, everything came into existence. And that, in a materialistic worldview, that can't be right. Something has to come from something. You have to have, but most Christians believe in ex nihilo, that it was created from nothing. And then Lawrence Krauss says, yeah, it was created from nothing, but it's not a nothing that you think of as a nothing. It's a positive and negative that cancel out into perfect equilibrium. Matter, antimatter. It's a great mystery. So let's go exploring, right? We don't have to agree or disagree. Let's go exploring. And what's so fun, I mentioned the Planck, it's not the Planck, it's the newest one, Jack Webb. The new Jack Webb telescope has completely disrupted all of our thinking. When I was in high school, we thought about a cyclical universe. By 1996, nope, there's a big bang and a big death, a heat death. Now, the model isn't working anymore because we've discovered that the galaxies formed way earlier than we thought. Okay, so it's more fun to kind of sit on the sidelines and eat popcorn and watch the stuff happen than it is to I'm going to be committed to this point of view. That's actually, history teaches us that's a bad plan. Because you get committed to one point of view that can change. And I think it's smarter for us to just kind of enjoy the ride. I've taught, the evolution thing is a big deal to me, if you can't tell. When I was in high school, that was like the big question. And how do we reconcile this evolution thing? So I've been tracking that and read quite thoroughly all the different kinds of, well, not all, but the spectrum of views on life and how it came into being, all the way from, God created it, boom, Ken Ham answers in Genesis, one day, all the way to progressive evolution or theistic evolution. There's a whole range in there of possible ways that God could have done it. I heard a scientist from the Vatican give a lecture one time at a university. I went and listened. And he said, if you have a Big Bang and it has the right parameters, then you're going to have condensation. And if you have condensation, you're going to have atoms. And if you have atoms, you're going to have suns. And if you have suns, you're going to have heavier elements. And if you have heavier elements, you're going to have molecules. And if you have molecules, you're going to have life. And if you have life, you're going to have human. In other words, all this stuff is inevitable. If you start with the right starting conditions, it's inevitable that you would get life at the end. It was interesting. And he's from the Vatican. He's a scientist Vatican. So I think the Catholic Church tends to lean towards theistic evolution, that it was kind of set all in motion. Evangelical churches tend to lean towards a younger earth. They tend to. And I don't need to choose, because I answered that question. I told you that to me it's moot, because God could have created it a second ago. And so since I know he created it with age, it's not a conflict for me. I don't care which it is. In fact, let's just go exploring. and see what happened. Did Adam have a belly button or not? I don't think he did, because he wasn't born, right? I mean, it's a fun thing to just kind of think about that stuff. And I don't know. I think that's the way God made us. He made us curious. There are other. I guess we're too big to get in today, but consciousness to me is probably the most amazing scientific frontier right now. We believe we're conscious. We believe we have a mind. Well, where does that mind exist? Is that all materialistic, or are there transcendental properties? Is the spirit and soul exist separate from any materialistic stuff? To me, that's like right now, that's where the frontier is. And that's why all this stuff about AI is going to become so interesting. Is once the AI reaches a certain level of sophistication, is it conscious? Is it a living being? And how do you think? To me, that's kind of where we're at in this frontier. Yes, brother.
One of my favorite philosophers is William Lane Craig.
William Lane Craig, he's awesome.
And he poses the question, the cosmological question, that if there is no God, then life is meaningless. And of course, he quotes Nietzsche, that life spirals into meaninglessness, which seems to be the dilemma that man is facing right now. Because trying to remove God from your life, I don't care if you believe in evolution or not, you're chasing after the wind, as Solomon said. Because if there's no God, anything you do is good. It has no ultimate meaning or purpose. And so I think he does a great job of kind of cutting to the heart of the matter of evolution versus creation.
Yeah, and he debates with Dawkins, and he's debated with several. I've listened to all those debates. I love listening. All is too big a word, but several of those debates. William Lane Craig is probably the most systematic philosophical organizer of the apologetics. He's a little dry because of that. He gets up there, here are the bullet points, and boom, 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 and he lays it all out. But the debates get kind of spicy. I loved it when he was debating Hitchens. Hitchens, before Christopher Hitchens passed, he was a great rhetorical orator, and they would have these debates. And then Lennox and Hitchens have had, I love Lennox. To me, Lennox is stunning. To Pastor's comment, without God, there's no meaning. There's no why? Why should we do this or that? Why not just serve ourselves? Why not just increase the maximum amount of pleasure and the maximum amount of life we can have and die, because it's all meaningless anyway. But once you have God, then there's like teleology. There's a purpose. There's a meaning in the universe. Yeah, there's no good and evil if there's no, exactly. There's only what's most advantageous for us or whatever. So I think having God is a more meaningful worldview. It gives more meaning in life. But I also think it's true. I mean, it bears out in my life. Now, I could be wrong, but my personal experience tells me God's real, and it's awfully cool. Lennox deals with another issue, and that's the problem of evil. If God is real, then why do we have all this crap? And problem of pain, and why is it all so bad? And I guess maybe I'll just finish with that, but C.S. Lewis writes about this. You remember with C.S. Lewis, he was a famous author, radio program through World War II and whatnot in Europe, writing regularly for journals, very successful. He's in his mid-40s, and he meets this beautiful journalist from America. And he falls madly in love with her, and 6 months later they're married, and then 6 months later she dies of cancer. And he's angry. Hey, God, I was perfectly happy, perfectly successful professor, enjoying my life, and you bring this woman into my life. I fall madly in love. Now I have 2 stepchildren. And then you took her away from me. Why did you do that? I was perfectly fine without that. Why did you do that? And so then he went through his grief. And then as he was going through that, he kind of looked back on it, and he asked himself this question. He said, if I had to do all over again, knowing that she would be taken away from me, would I do it anyway? Was the pain that I experience now, is the pain I'm experiencing now, is it worth it for the love and the joy I experienced then? And the answer is yes, it was. That's it. And so he said, I guess that's the experiment God did. He created this whole universe, knowing full well that his son was going to suffer and die. Miserable death on the cross. But it's worth it for the relationship that he got to have with us in this brief period of time on earth. And I think that's the meaning and purpose thing there. Anyway, how about that? Is that a good place to end it? All right, thank you.